My name is Marielle Hutton. I am 32 years old, and I fix old clocks for a living in a small town in upstate Vermont, the kind of town where, once a month, a moving truck backs up to somebody's front porch and carries their whole life away in cardboard boxes. My family has never taken my work seriously. They call it the thing I never grew out of. My mother has a nickname for me that she trots out every holiday, usually before I've even hung up my coat. Last Christmas, I handed my parents a small wrapped box. My mother laughed, the short, dismissive laugh she saves for me, and said something about it probably being another dollar store candle from the family disappointment. My father didn't look up from his phone. My sister told me to skip mine and open hers instead, because hers, she said, was actually worth something. So I took my box back. I opened it alone, in front of all of them, right there on the living room floor. That moment wasn't the end of anything. It was the hinge the whole year swung on. 4 months later, I stood up in a crowded auction room, inside a building where my grandmother had spent 22 years of her life, and I gave away the last thing I had left, on purpose, out loud in front of strangers. If you're new here, this is the channel where we talk about the quiet ones in families, the people who got quietly written off, and what happens the year they finally stop asking to be counted. If that sounds familiar, stay with me and consider subscribing before we get into it, because this story has a lot of turns. It started on an ordinary Tuesday in early March. I had a 19th century wall clock movement sitting on my bench and a stubborn, chipped pivot that had been eating at me for 4 straight days. My workshop sits on the ground floor of a narrow brick building downtown, underneath the apartment I rent from my landlady. It smells permanently of clock oil, sawdust, and the ancient space heater I keep promising myself I'll replace. Almost all my customers are retirees. They bring in kitchen clocks that cost $40 new and would cost $200 to repair properly, and they stand at my counter with their hands folded and say, "Fix it anyway." That's most of my income. I make it work. That particular morning, I'd finally turned a new pivot out of blued steel, set the movement back in its case, and heard it pick up its steady tick again. I let myself feel proud for about 90 seconds. That's my personal limit before guilt creeps back in. Then a white pickup rattled past my front window, the bed loaded with banker's boxes and a dresser wrapped in blue moving blankets. The company name stenciled on the door in green letters, my sister's estate liquidation business. It was the 3rd week in a row I'd seen that truck go by. Our town has fewer than 1,000 people in it, and lately there are more houses emptying out than filling up, and my sister is the one emptying most of them. She is, without exaggeration, the best in 3 counties at what she does. She can walk into a dead stranger's house on a Tuesday and have every item in it priced, boxed and routed to the right buyer by Friday, all without ever raising her voice at a grieving relative. I watched the truck disappear around the corner and went back to my bench, with no idea that the thing I had been quietly hunting for 6 years was sitting less than 50 yards away from me, mixed into a plastic bin full of dead wristwatches and somebody's costume jewellery. Here's something about my trade that nobody finds remotely interesting until, suddenly, it matters enormously. For 6 years I have made a habit of scrolling through every estate sale listing and consignment auction within a 2-hour radius of my shop. I keep a running folder of bad, blurry photographs, pictures taken by people who have no idea what they're actually photographing. About once a month, something in the corner of one of those photos catches my eye, and I place a small bid. Most of the time I'm wrong. I've bought a tote full of pop metal alarm clocks that were worthless. I've bought a shoebox of gears that turned out to belong to an old sewing machine. My sister calls it gambling, and she's not entirely wrong, except the odds are terrible and the prize. When I actually win is usually nothing more than a good story. In early March, a house clearing company, 2 counties over, posted 11 photographs of somebody's cluttered garage. Photo 7 showed a plastic storage tote shot from directly above, badly lit. In the top corner of that photo sat an open wristwatch case. The back popped off the way it looks when someone has taken it apart and never bothered to close it back up. And scratched into the inside of that case back were faint marks, not decorative engraving, but service marks. For over a century, watchmakers have scratched the date of a repair into the case back with a graver, so the next person to open it knows who touched it and when. Those marks build up over decades the way rings build up inside a tree trunk. You can't read individual numbers from a grainy photo like that. But you can make out a shape. And one of those scratched numbers had a short bar across the top, in a style I had seen exactly once before in my entire life. I bid $340 on the whole unopened tote, sight unseen, on a Tuesday night, and then sat at my kitchen table for an hour trying to talk myself out of hoping for anything. The box arrived 8 days later, packed in old newspaper. Inside were 22 items worth essentially nothing: 2 cracked plastic travel clocks, a tangle of old watch bands, a brass barometer with the guts missing. I laid each piece out along my workbench in a neat row, the way I always do, because you genuinely never know. And then, right at the bottom of the tote, I found it. A nickel-cased pocket watch, roughly 2 inches across, its dial browned with age, the minute hand snapped clean off at the joint. It sat in the palm of my hand like a stone I had been carrying around my whole life without ever noticing the weight. I turned the case over under my desk lamp. Layer upon layer of decades-old service scratches overlapped each other across the metal, and down near the edge, cut small, shallow, and careful. The way you cut something when you're not technically supposed to be cutting it at all were 2 initials. Beneath them, the number 114, with that same short crossbar through the numeral I had seen only once before. On the 2 bench watches, my old mentor, an elderly clockmaker named Everett Doyle, still kept in the second drawer of his desk. There used to be a clockworks factory downtown that ran from 1911 until 1974, 4 stories of red brick sitting at the bottom of Main Street. At its busiest, it employed nearly 200 people building cheap, sturdy kitchen clock movements that ended up in houses all over the country. Every finisher on the factory floor was issued a personal bench watch, numbered to match their workstation, to check their timing against as they worked. My grandmother, a woman named Adeline Ferris, started working there in 1952, at 18 years old. She sat at bench 114 for 22 straight years, until the day the factory finally locked its doors. She was 40 by then. For the rest of her life, that watch sat on the windowsill above her kitchen sink, and she wound it faithfully every Sunday after church. When I was 6, she let me hold it once while she washed dishes and told me, very seriously, not to breathe on the dial. She passed away in 2011, the year I turned 19. I sat down right there on the floor of my own workshop, my back against the cabinet, holding that watch with both hands, and the only thought in my head was, how did this end up 40 yards from my shop, in a stranger's garage? I did not bring that question up at the next family dinner, and if you've ever had a family like mine, you probably already understand exactly why not. My parents still live in the same house they bought back in 1988, a 6-minute drive from my shop. My mother, Colette, is 63 and spent 24 years working the front office at the local elementary school. She has exactly one defense mechanism, and she's mastered it completely. She marks everything down in value before anyone else can want it first. The pot roast is dry. The town is finished. That coat looked better on the hanger than it does on you. If she decides something is worthless before it can be taken from her, then losing it never costs her anything. She's been doing this for so long, I genuinely don't think she hears herself doing it anymore. My father, Warren, is 66. He used to run a small lumber and hardware business downtown, until it folded in 2009. He has not said the name of that business out loud in my presence since. Most evenings he sits at the kitchen table, silently scrolling his phone. That particular night, my sister Bree came in 40 minutes late, still wearing her work coat, smelling faintly of somebody else's basement, and announced she'd just landed a huge new contract, an entire estate, the building, the business, all of its contents. The elderly owner had held onto it for over 50 years and never touched a thing. Now his heirs, scattered across 2 states, wanted it liquidated completely, everything sold off by the box. I had a piece of that exact same building's history sitting in my coat pocket, hanging on the hook by the front door, 10 feet from where we sat eating dinner. I didn't say a single word about it. Not because I was afraid of them, but because I already knew precisely what would happen the moment I did. Somebody at that table would immediately ask what it was worth. My sister let me walk through the old factory with her one Thursday, while she did her first inventory pass, mostly because she needed someone to hold the other end of a tape measure. The stairwell still had its original rubber tread. The second floor had once been the finishing room, and I actually stopped dead in the doorway, because there were 32 workbenches still bolted to the floorboards in 4 neat rows, sunlight coming in cold and high through window glass so old it rippled like water. Someone had stacked folding chairs across half of them back in 1974, and no one had touched them since. The front edge of every bench had worn down into a smooth, shallow curve where forearms had rested for 60 years straight. I put my hand flat against one of them. My sister wrote numbers on her clipboard and told me the whole floor would sell off as bulk lots, tools by the crate, and that some out-of-state buyer had already inquired about purchasing the building itself. Against the back wall stood a battered grey 4-drawer steel filing cabinet. When I pulled open the second drawer, it came out heavy, packed with maybe 40 cloth-bound ledgers, water-stained along the bottom edge. I opened one at random. It was a daily finishing log, date, movement number, workstation number, and a name written in a different hand every few entries, as the shop foreman changed over the years. I ran my finger down one column from 1961 and found a specific line. I closed the ledger before my sister could look up, slid the drawer shut and said nothing. I've thought about why I did that many times since. I think, somewhere underneath, I already understood that the second she knew what was sitting in that cabinet, it would instantly have a dollar figure attached to it. And I wanted it to remain simply a thing, for one more day, before it turned into a number on somebody's spreadsheet. My old mentor, Everett Doyle, is 78 now, and lives in a memory care facility about 25 minutes outside town. He taught me everything I know about this trade. I apprenticed under him for 6 years, standing at his right shoulder, while he said absolutely nothing until I made a mistake. When his memory began failing in 2022, he signed his entire shop over to me, the bench, the tools, and a collection of American clock movements he'd been assembling since he was 24. People hear that story and assume I was handed a gift. What I was actually handed was an ongoing storage and insurance bill I've been quietly covering for 2 years, out of a business that clears maybe $30,000 in a good year. I've never once resented carrying that weight. I've also never once been able to fully relax about it. That March, I brought him his favourite coffee in a mainspring window to hold. He wasn't entirely sure of my name that day. He called me the girl from the shop downtown, which was close enough. Then, when I told him about finding the watch, I put a pair of tweezers into his right hand out of habit, and something in his forearm simply woke up. His fingers rolled them into working position without him even looking, the way they'd done for 60 years, because with people like him, the hands are always the very last thing to forget. When I stood up to leave, he caught my sleeve at the doorway and repeated something he used to tell me constantly when I was 20 and impatient, except this time it seemed to arrive fresh, like a new thought. A clock doesn't just keep time. It keeps a promise. Then, almost weightlessly, he added, "Keep my bench together. Don't let anyone break it apart." I told him I wouldn't. I meant every word of it. I asked my sister to set one single drawer aside from the sale. I deliberately chose to ask her at her office on a weekday morning, rather than at our parents' dinner table, because at the family table she has an audience to perform for, and at her office she only has a schedule, which is much easier to argue with than an audience. I explained that the ledgers in that cabinet were the only surviving record of who had actually built what inside that factory, and that if they were sold off as a bulk lot of scrap paper, they'd be pulped or scattered within a month. I asked her to set them aside, donate them, sell them to me for whatever a crate of damp old paper is technically worth, and I'd personally haul them out myself. She let me finish completely. She always lets you finish. It's part of what makes her so good at her job. Then she calmly explained point by point exactly why she couldn't. She wasn't the property owner. She was simply the agent for an estate with 2 heirs living in 2 different states, working under a signed contract stating every single item goes to auction and every dollar goes to the estate. She couldn't just gift a dead man's property to her own sister. If she tried, the heir's attorney would take her apart, and her business would never get another referral in this county again. She was right about every word of it. The entire building was scheduled to go under the hammer, on site, the second Saturday of the following April, 13 months out, because a sale of that scale takes that long to properly catalogue across 4 floors. You want me to quietly carve out the one thing you personally care about, she said, and call it housekeeping. I told her that wasn't fair. She said fairness had nothing to do with any of this. Then she said the sentence I have turned over in my mind every day since, delivered in that flat, patient, almost gentle voice she reserves for people who have just lost a parent. Nothing is worth what you feel about it. It's only worth what somebody actually hands you for it. She wasn't trying to be cruel. That's the part nobody ever believes when I tell this story. She was slowly explaining her actual worldview to me, because she genuinely thought I hadn't absorbed it yet. Our town's small historical society operates out of 2 cramped rooms above the old fire station, run by a retired schoolteacher named Harriet Vance, who taught my sister 8th grade civics decades ago. I visited her on a Saturday with photographs of the filing cabinet and a 2-page list of what I believed it contained. Harriet made tea in a chipped pot and listened to me uninterrupted for a full 20 minutes, which is more patience than anyone in my own family has shown me in years. The society has a few hundred paying members, of whom perhaps a handful actually do anything. They own a Civil War-era drum, 60 years of the local newspaper on microfilm, and a bucket positioned under a leak in the roof that someone empties on a rotating schedule. She told me she'd bring my request to the board at their January meeting. She told me sincerely that she thought it mattered. Then she said something else that lodged itself under my ribs, said while staring at that leaking bucket rather than at me. Everybody in this town claims they want us to preserve history. Nobody wants to help pay the heating bill on it. I walked home that afternoon past the boarded-up storefront that used to be my father's lumber business, vacant for 15 years now, a crooked closed sign still hanging in the door, and past my own shop, thinking about how a town can insist it's proud of its past, right up until the exact moment that past costs $40 a month to maintain. Part 6. What restoration actually means that. Night I sat down at my bench with the bench watch under the lamp, its case back removed, and began work I already knew would take up the better part of a year, because there wasn't a single component in that watch I could fix quickly, and there wasn't a single thing in my life at that moment I could fix at all. Either. Repair means making something function again. Restoration means making it function while preserving its entire history intact. And the hardest skill in restoration is knowing precisely what not to touch. The mainspring had gone slack and tired, so I replaced it, since a spring is a consumable part nobody 100 years from now will care about. The balance staff had a bent pivot, so I hand-turned a new one on the lathe across 4 separate evenings, took 3 attempts to get it right. The crystal was long gone, so I fitted a new one. But I sat for a long time with the dial itself, and ultimately left it exactly as I found it, browned around the 6, where 70 years of a thumb had pressed to set the time, a hairline crack beneath the 12. Plenty of restorers would have refinished that dial for an extra $100 at resale, and erased my grandmother's thumbprint in the process. Every evening from April clear through December, I want to be completely honest with you, because I've had a full year now to sit with this feeling. I loved that work more than I have ever loved talking to another human being. Sitting alone with a dead machine and slowly bringing it back to life is the one thing in my entire life I have ever been genuinely, completely good at. It costs nothing but time, and it never once asks you to give anything up. You simply keep every part, every screw, every original hand. Nothing is ever lost. And you never have to decide what you're willing to sacrifice. If you happen to be listening to this while you're fixing something nobody else believes is worth fixing, an old chair, a dented pan, a strained relationship, I'd genuinely like to know. Tell me in the comments what you're keeping alive right now, and if this channel has become somewhere you come to feel a little less alone about your own family, go ahead and subscribe, so the next story finds you too. That October, my sister gave me exactly 3 hours inside the building before her sorting crew began boxing up the 2nd floor. She set a timer on her phone, told me not to physically remove anything, and went downstairs to argue with a scrap metal hauler. I opened that filing cabinet and read standing up for the entire 3 hours. There were 38 finishing ledgers in total, spanning 1922 through 1974, and they weren't summaries, they were daily entries. Every single movement that left that floor got its own line. The date, the movement number, the workstation, and the surname and first initial of the person who finished it. Bench 4, a name. Bench 19, a name. Bench 31, a name. I counted the distinct workstations and the distinct people. Across the shop's final 2 decades alone, there were 41 different names recorded, and 36 of them belonged to women. That is what a finishing room actually was. That is exactly who sat inside one. On the page dated the 12th of November 1961, bench 114, Ferris A. I still have her old employment paperwork in a folder at home, pulled after she passed. Under occupation, it simply says assembler, not clockmaker, not finisher, not craftswoman. Assembler, the word you use for someone considered interchangeable. And yet she sat at that same bench for 22 years, and her hands are inside working clock movements in houses across every single state in this country. I stood in that empty room with an open ledger balanced on my forearm and understood 2 things simultaneously. First, that this was the only complete surviving record that Factory had ever produced, and it had survived purely by accident, tucked inside a cabinet nobody had bothered to open in 50 years. The second realization took me another 5 months to fully understand, and once I did, it ended up costing me absolutely everything I had. I tried talking to my mother about it in November. I approached it carefully, at her kitchen table, a dish towel in my hand for something to occupy myself with. I mentioned Grandma Adeline's old kitchen, the yellow curtains, and asked whether she remembered the watch that used to sit on the windowsill above the sink, the one wound every Sunday. My mother was rinsing a colander at the time. She went still, 1 beat longer than a person normally holds still, the water still running. Then she shut it off and said flatly that there was no such watch, that I was misremembering an old photograph. I told her I wasn't. I told her I had actually held it in my hands. She dried her hands on the towel I was holding, a small habit of hers, repeated the same denial, and moved on to my father's cholesterol numbers and the price of heating oil. She never circled back to it. That was the moment I stopped believing my family had simply forgotten something. You don't freeze like that over something you've genuinely forgotten. A few minutes later, while putting the colander away, she added the rest of it, without any real heat in her voice, delivered the way you'd read off a warning label. Your grandmother put clock parts in a box for 22 years. That's not a career, honey. That's just a job. I sat there holding the dish towel and finally understood the whole shape of it, even if I couldn't have said it out loud at the time. In my family, if you simply decide the thing you lost was never worth anything to begin with, then technically you never lost anything at all. It's an extremely efficient system. It's kept my mother functioning for 15 years. The only flaw in that system is that it requires everyone around her to agree with it, and I was the one person who kept refusing to. I stopped by my parents' house on a Wednesday in December to drop off a storm window I'd had repaired, and found my father alone in the garage, the door half raised, the little propane heater running, his phone held 6 inches from his face, thumb pulling down to refresh a page over and over. When he finally noticed me and turned, he flipped the phone face down against his leg, which told me more than the screen ever could have. When I asked him directly, he answered, because he's never been a very good liar, and because he's 66 and simply tired. It was his bank account page. He'd been refreshing it roughly every hour for most of the year, the way you worry at a loose tooth. They were 5 months behind on the mortgage. With late fees and unpaid property taxes included, the total came to just over $21,000, a number he recited out loud in the flat voice of a man who has repeated it to himself so many times it stopped meaning anything at all. He hadn't told my mother the full amount. He hadn't told me any of it either. He'd run that lumber business downtown for 22 years and banked at that same institution since he was 19. And now he couldn't bring himself to walk in and face the teller he used to coach in softball. That was the actual detail that broke him, not the money itself, the counter. He put the phone back in his coat pocket, picked up the storm window and said, "Your sister's got a plan." She always does. I stood there in that cold garage and did the math I suspect you've already worked out yourself. There was exactly one plan available to this family, and it involved a building full of workbenches, a steel filing cabinet, and 38 cloth-bound ledgers with my grandmother's name written inside them. On Christmas Eve, I wound that watch for the final time before wrapping it. It had been running steadily on my bench for 9 straight days by then, which is how you actually prove out a repair job. You never trust a watch until it's told you the truth for a full week. It ran 40 seconds fast per day. I could have corrected that easily, shaved a bit off the hairspring, moved the regulator hard over, but the regulator was already near the very end of its adjustment range, and pushing it further would have meant undoing something my grandmother's own hands had originally set decades ago. I wasn't willing to do that, even for the sake of perfect accuracy for a woman who was no longer alive to appreciate it. So it still runs 40 seconds fast. It runs that way to this day. I placed it inside a box smaller than my own hand, nestled in cotton wadding, wrapped in plain brown craft paper, because I didn't own any Christmas wrapping paper, and because I have genuinely never once in my life managed to make a bow lie flat. Then I sat in my truck outside my own shop with the heater running, rehearsing exactly what I planned to say. I had an entire speech prepared, the year, the county, the bench number, a line about her letting me hold it as a child. It was, admittedly, a speech, and I have never once successfully delivered a speech to my own family in my life. I said it out loud to my windshield twice. Then I tucked the box into my coat pocket and drove the 6 minutes to my parents' house the next morning, with it pressed against my ribs. Going there, I want to be absolutely clear, not to win anything. I was going there to hand my mother her own mother back. That was genuinely all I wanted. I've never gotten anything that clean out of that house in my entire life. Christmas morning runs on a strict schedule at my parents' place, coffee first, then the grandchild's presents, then the adults. Then my mother starts the ham promptly at 11, whether anyone else is finished opening gifts or not. My niece, 9 years old, had already worked through most of a large plastic storage bin of toys. My father sat in his recliner with his phone. My sister perched on the arm of the couch in a green sweater, coffee balanced carefully on her knee. My mother was already picking stray wrapping paper up off the rug, because she genuinely cannot sit in a room with loose paper on the floor. I waited for a quiet moment, took the small brown box from my coat and placed it in my mother's hands, telling her it was for both my parents together. She looked down at it and let out that short, dismissive laugh, the one that sounds like a door closing, and guessed it was probably another dollar store candle from the family disappointment. My father never looked up from his phone. My sister, without any real malice in her voice, the way you gently redirect a toddler, told me to just open hers instead. It was actually worth something. Hers turned out to be a coffee machine. The price sticker still stuck to the corner of the box. I'd like to tell you something inside me shattered right then. That isn't actually what happened. What happened is that I went very calm, the same particular calm that settles over me when a stubborn pivot refuses to seat properly. I reached over and quietly took my box back out of my mother's hands. I sat down on the edge of the coffee table. I peeled the tape off one careful seam at a time because I wasn't about to tear it. I lifted the watch free of the cotton and held it up, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. This is bench 114 from the old Clockworks factory downtown. It belonged to your mother. It came out of a garage 2 counties over back in March. It's been sitting on my bench since April, and it's been running for 9 days straight. My mother's expression did something I had genuinely never once seen it do. It came apart completely, not gracefully. She pressed both hands over her mouth and made a sound that wasn't really a word at all, her shoulders shaking. My father finally looked up from his phone and set it face down on the arm of his chair, which, for him, might as well be an entire paragraph of confession. He stared at the watch with his mouth slightly open, like a man looking into a room he used to actually live in. Nobody spoke for a long stretch, and in that silence, every single person in that room could hear it quietly ticking. Here's what I genuinely believed would happen next, because I'd had 9 months to build up the fantasy in my head. My mother would hold it, tell my niece about the yellow curtains, and my father would finally speak his mother-in-law's name out loud, and we'd get 1 single hour of feeling like a family that actually remembered something together. Here's what actually happened instead. My mother took the watch, held it for roughly 4 seconds. I watched her thumb instinctively find the worn brown patch near the 6 without even looking, which told me everything about how many thousands of times she'd once watched her own mother do exactly that. Then set it down on the side table, face up, and announced the ham needed to go in the oven, and walked into the kitchen to run the sink water. My father said, "That's a nice piece of work," the same sentence he uses about a well-built deck. He never picked it up. The only person in that entire house who touched it again was my niece, who knelt beside the side table and asked if she could listen to it. I picked it up and held it gently against her ear. She went completely still, then whispered that it was running fast. I told her that was on purpose. She thought that was the single funniest thing she had ever heard in her life. And that was Christmas. I got my coat around noon. Out in the driveway, my sister was standing beside her truck with her arms crossed, waiting for me in the freezing cold without her coat on, which meant she'd already been standing out there deciding something for a while. She didn't ease into it. She looked at the side of my head and said flatly, "I sold it." She'd been 21 in 2010. I was 17. That's the detail I need you to actually hold on to, because I've spent 15 years being angry about that particular year, without ever once doing that math honestly in front of a mirror. My father's business had collapsed the previous fall. The bank gave them 90 days. My mother couldn't get out of bed for most of that February. My father couldn't bring himself to walk into his own building and sell off his own inventory. So my sister did it herself. 19, the very first time she ever priced a stranger's belongings. 21, the day she priced our own family's. She sold the truck, the good furniture, my father's tools, the contents of 2 closets and an attic. She stood in our own front yard behind a folding table with a cash box, while men she'd gone to high school with picked through everything we owned, and she found that watch on the windowsill. She carried it upstairs and hid it in her sock drawer. Standing in that driveway on Christmas Day, arms crossed, no coat, she told me she'd kept it hidden there for 6 weeks. That she took it out and looked at it most nights. That she eventually drove it to a dealer 2 counties over that April and sold it for $90, crying the entire drive home with the radio switched off. "And then I stopped crying," she said, "because crying doesn't pay anything." I started to say her name. I got that far and she cut me off completely, the way a breaker trips, and said the sentence that knocked the floor out from under me for the following 4 months. "Don't you dare play the hero of a story you got to sit out." "You were 17. I was the one who signed the papers." Then she climbed into her truck and drove off. And she was right. And I hated it. I still hate it. And every difficult decision I made for the rest of that year grew directly out of standing in that driveway, knowing full well that she was right. The preliminary auction listing for the factory building went up in early January. 4 floors, over 600 individual lots viewing strictly by appointment. I scrolled through it for 20 minutes with a cup of coffee going cold beside me until I found it. Lot 218. 2nd floor finishing room contents. Hand tools, part stock, and a steel filing cabinet including production record ledgers. Estimated at $8,000 to $12,000. That was the entire description. Someone had walked through that room with a clipboard and priced my grandmother's 22 years of work at roughly the value of a used car. I had $6,400 saved. That was my entire cushion, 11 years of setting aside whatever I could from a business that fixes $40 kitchen clocks for $200. Because somebody's late mother used to wind one every Sunday. $6,400 against a starting estimate of $8,000 in a room full of dealers who'd be standing there in April with a buyer's premium stacked on top of every bid. I ran the numbers 3 separate times, hunting for a version where it actually worked, and there simply wasn't one. So I did something I had genuinely never done before in my life. I got out a legal pad and wrote at the very top a list of things I could sell to make up the difference. And then I sat there holding the pen for a long time before writing a single word beneath it. Because deep down, I already knew there was only ever going to be one item on that list, and I wasn't ready yet to see it in my own handwriting. An elderly neighbour who owned several downtown storefronts came into my shop late in January in her good coat, meaning she'd come straight from somewhere important. She told me, apologising twice before she managed to get the words out, that she'd sold her entire block of buildings to an out-of-state holding company, a name on a filing, not a person you could ever actually call. She was 74, her knees were failing, and the buyout offer was far more money than those buildings had ever been worth in her lifetime. My own lease ran through the end of June. The new owners weren't renewing anything on that block. I stood in my own shop that afternoon, looking at a wall of clock movements hanging on nails, and felt the same current that had swept through that elderly stranger's estate, now sweeping straight up my own street. About to carry off my workbench, my landlady's retirement plan, and my father's old faded storefront sign, all in a single pass, and there was no single villain steering it. My sister hadn't started any of this. That's the part I genuinely wish I could say and can't. Nobody in this entire story started it. We were all simply standing wherever it happened to be flowing. Harriet from the Historical Society called me in early February and mercifully skipped the small talk. The board had voted no, not out of indifference, she said. 2 of them had actually cried during the vote, which I believed completely, because in a town this small, half the board's own mothers had worked inside that very factory. They voted no, because the society had no insurance policy that would cover housing the collection, no climate control, only 400 square feet of dry floor space, and an ageing roof. They'd been fundraising to fix that roof since 2017. 38 water-damaged ledgers needed a genuinely stable environment and someone available to carefully turn their pages. Harriet said it to me plainly, and it remains the single kindest, cruelest thing anyone said to me all year. We simply can't take proper care of it, and I refuse to pretend that we can. I told her I understood. I truly did understand, and that understanding was exactly what made it unbearable. If she'd been careless or dismissive about it, I could have channeled my anger somewhere. Anger is fuel I know how to run on. Instead, she'd simply told me the plain truth and quietly closed the very last door available to me. I want to ask you something before we go any further. Is there something in your own family that everyone silently agreed to call worthless? A house, a language, a trade, a person? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely read everyone. And if you want to find out exactly how far I was ultimately willing to go, stay with me. And go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss where this ends. There's a door at the back of my shop I open maybe twice a year. Behind it sits my mentor Everett's workbench, exactly as it came out of his old shop in 2022, the surface scarred with 60 years of burn marks and one long gouge from an accident back in the 70s, his pegboard of tools still hanging in the precise order his hands always knew by memory, 3 drawers of gravers he ground himself, and beneath the window a cabinet holding 50 years of American clock movements he'd collected one at a time out of barns and church rummage sales, an almost complete factory run, plus a rare toolcase movement he was still talking about even inside the memory care facility. I know exactly what all of it is worth, because appraisal is part of my job, and because I've insured it every single year, broken up properly and sold through the right channels, it would likely bring somewhere in the $30,000 range. I sat down on the stool in that back room on the 4th of February, still wearing my coat, and didn't bother turning on the light. I sat there until the window faded from grey to full black, thinking about him catching my sleeve in that doorway. "Don't let anyone break it apart." He'd said it so lightly, the way you'd ask someone to remember to water a plant. There was nothing else left on that legal pad. There was never going to be anything else. I drove out to see him that Thursday and told him, honestly, that I wasn't going to make this decision behind his back, even though every practical person in my life would have told me that visit was really for my own conscience, not his. I sat in the chair by his window, radiator ticking away, and told Everett Doyle that I was going to sell his entire collection, his tools, and his bench. I explained exactly why. The ledgers, the 41 names, my grandmother at bench 114, my parents' mortgage. He listened to the whole thing with his entire face, the way he used to listen whenever I explained why I'd done some repair the wrong way. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me gently who I was. I sat with him another 20 minutes. I put the tweezers back into his right hand out of habit, and his fingers rolled them into position on their own, and he carefully picked a stray thread off his blanket and set it down on the windowsill with the precision of a surgeon, and smiled at it. I didn't cry on the drive home, though I won't pretend that was strength. I've genuinely cried over stuck screws before. Some things simply pass straight through the part of you that reacts that way. I signed the consignment agreement that Friday. The final printed auction catalogue went to press 48 hours later, and that was the exact moment my old life quietly ended. I knew it even as it was happening. The instant that page went to print, his workbench stopped being a workbench. It became lot number 61. I had photographs of 11 pages from those ledgers saved on my phone from October. All through March, I spent 9 straight nights matching every single entry against every factory movement that had ever passed across my own bench, against the 4 I personally owned, and against a running list of serial number ranges I'd kept privately since I was 23. Because I am, apparently, exactly the kind of person who keeps a list like that. What I confirmed, standing at my bench at 2 a.m. with a loop pressed to my eye, was this. Those ledgers didn't just record production numbers. They tied every single movement to a specific bench, and every bench to a specific named person, across 52 consecutive years. There was no other surviving record like it anywhere. The company's corporate paperwork had burned in a fire decades earlier. The old Union Hall was now a laundromat. Every other American factory of that size had simply thrown its finishing ledgers in a dumpster the week it closed its doors. 36 women's names, with dates and serial numbers attached, inside an authentic American factory record. I sat down on my stool and understood exactly what I was holding, and simultaneously understood something else that made me genuinely sick. Lot 218 had been estimated at $8,000 because it looked to any outside eye like a truckload of dirty tools and damp waste paper. It looked that way because not a single person who'd walked through that room actually understood what they were looking at. And there was exactly one person in the entire state whose opinion on it would carry real authority. That person was me. I had built that trap myself, out of 12 patient years spent learning a dying trade. A well-known collector from out of state called me in late March, polite in a way that somehow made it worse. He'd received the printed catalogue, noticed Everett's name attached to Lot 61, said generous and accurate things about Everett's legendary eye for quality, then asked me, in the exact same casual tone he'd used to comment on the weather, whether there was anything else interesting coming out of that Vermont factory, anything not obvious from the listing itself. I stood at my own workbench, thumb resting on the worn wood edge, and heard myself answer, "Nothing you'd be interested in." He said that was a shame, thanked me, and hung up. I didn't move for a while afterward. It would have been so easy. It would have taken less than a single breath. Say nothing. Let it remain. Just a truckload of junk. Bid my $6,400, plus whatever Everett's bench brought in, and buy the entire lot for the price of a used pickup truck. Keep it in town. Open a proper bench again someday and teach someone the trade. Keep my grandmother's name safely tucked inside a drawer, in a building I'd own a literal piece of. That same afternoon, my sister texted me a photo of my parents' mortgage payoff quote. The total circled in ballpoint pen, just over $21,000. Underneath it she'd typed, "Proceeds should cover this if the second floor performs well." If Lot 218 only brought $8,000, it wouldn't come close. I sat in my shop, caught squarely between those two facts, for 3 full weeks, and told not one single living person which way I was going to go, mostly because I genuinely didn't know myself yet. The second Saturday of April arrived cold and pale white. The auction ran on site, on the second floor of the old factory itself, the way large sales like this always do, folding chairs set up between the empty workbenches, a portable podium at the front, an oil heater knocking away in the corner. Roughly 60 people crowded in wearing coats. Townspeople came just to look. 8 serious dealers showed up ready to bid. 3 more stayed on the phone lines. My sister worked the floor with a clipboard and a headset, and she was, without question, the calmest person in that entire room. Everett's lots sold within the first hour, the way premium consigned items typically go before a crowd tires out. Lot 61, the bench itself, sold to a shop from the next state over for $9,200. The staking set and wheel-cutting engine sold separately. The movement collection went in 4 separate lots, split between 2 phone bidders and a man in the 3rd row carrying a canvas bag. $38,500 total, split 3 ways, walking out 3 completely different doors. After the auction house's 20% commission, I had $30,800 coming to me on a check within 10 business days. I sat in the 4th row from the back and watched 2 men in work gloves carry the top of Everett Doyle's workbench down a staircase he himself had first climbed as a nervous apprentice back in 1964. I had the money. That had been the entire point of all of it. And I want to tell you honestly what having it actually felt like, because I think people expect some kind of dramatic scene, and there wasn't one. It felt like absolutely nothing. It felt like standing inside a room where all the furniture had just been carried out. My parents arrived around 10 that morning. I hadn't even known they were coming. My father stood at the back near the stairwell, hands jammed in his jacket pockets, studying the ceiling beams the way a lumberman instinctively does. My mother walked down the side aisle and sat down in the folding chair right next to mine, without a single word, still smelling faintly of her own house, her purse held tightly in both hands on her lap, staring straight ahead at the podium. We sat there together like two strangers waiting at the same bus stop. My niece perched up on a deep windowsill at the far end of the room, boots swinging. Lot 218 was still 14 lots away when I got up, walked to the clerk's table, and formally requested permission from the estate's agent, my sister, to say a few words about the lot's provenance from the floor before it opened for bidding. It's a completely ordinary request. Sellers grant it constantly, because when the room understands the history behind a piece, the room leans in, and the lot tends to sell for more. She looked at me for a long moment, and I watched her mentally run the calculation behind her eyes. A local expert stands up, talks about the history, the room warms up, the lot brings a stronger price, the estate profits more, her own commission grows, and that circled mortgage number gets fully covered. 1 minute, she said. Don't editorialise. She gave me that minute because she genuinely believed she already knew what I planned to do with it. So did I, right up until about 9 seconds before I actually did it. The auctioneer read my name and my trade into the microphone and handed me the wireless mic. The room quieted in that uneven, half-interested way rooms do. I stood up in the 4th row rather than walking to the front, and I've thought about why since, and I believe it's because I genuinely wanted to be standing among the benches. Themselves, when I said it, I explained what the building had actually been, a finishing shop that operated from 1911 to 1974, sending ordinary clock movements into kitchens across the entire country. I explained what the filing cabinet actually held, 38, unbroken production ledgers spanning 1922 through 1974. I explained precisely what made them unlike anything else currently on the market, and I kept it plain because I only had 1 minute. These ledgers don't simply record output. They record attribution. Every single movement is tied to a specific workbench, and every workbench is tied to a named person for 52 consecutive years. The company's own corporate records had burned decades ago. This cabinet was the only place these particular people still existed in writing anywhere. Then I took the bench watch out of my coat pocket and set it on the corner of the clerk's table, close to the microphone stand, face up and visibly running. And I read the names aloud slowly, 41 of them, one after another, bench by bench, without offering a single word of explanation for any of them. By roughly the 15th name, the room had gone so completely silent that between each name you could actually hear the watch ticking on the table. 36 of those 41 names belong to women. Their official government paperwork calls every one of them an assembler. I finished with the one line I had actually practiced that morning, driving over at 6 a.m. The only part of the whole speech I'd truly rehearsed. Bench 114. Ferris A, 1952 to 1974. That one was my grandmother. Then I added the only sentence in this entire story I would ever genuinely call my own. Every one of these people was once told this work wasn't worth anything. So was I. I'd like the record to say otherwise for once. I set the microphone down beside the watch and sat back down. My bidding paddle stayed face down on my knee for the rest of the auction, and I never once lifted it. They opened lot 218 at $9,000, and it was already at $22,000 before the auctioneer had finished his second breath. The temperature of the entire room had visibly shifted. 2 phone bidders jumped in simultaneously. The man in the 3rd row with the canvas bag dropped out around $31,000 and turned fully around in his seat to look directly at me. I genuinely couldn't read his expression at all. By $45,000, only 3 bidders remained. By $60,000, just 2. I sat in my folding chair with $30,800 arriving by check in 10 business days, my paddle still face down on my knee, and watched the price climb straight past everything I actually had, and then straight past everything I could have possibly scraped together. And I let it happen on purpose. I wish I could tell you I felt righteous in that moment. What I actually felt was like I was slowly drowning, very quietly, in a room full of strangers wearing winter coats. The out-of-state collector finally won it by phone at $74,000, and the hammer came down, and 41 names left the state inside a moving truck the following Tuesday. Somewhere around the 68,000 mark, my mother, who had not said one single word to me all morning, who hadn't looked at me even once, who was still gripping her purse with both hands, reached over and closed her hand gently around my wrist. She didn't turn her head. She didn't squeeze. She simply left her hand resting there for the remainder of that lot, and for the 2 lots that followed it. My mother is 63 years old, and she has never once in my entire life told me she was sorry for anything. That was it. That was the complete apology, delivered silently in a folding chair, over the sound of a man on a headset auctioning off my grandmother's life by the crate. I let her keep her hand there. I have never once told her that I understood exactly what it meant. I went straight to the clerk's table before I went anywhere else. Nobody in my family paid a single dollar for what I chose to do that morning. That was the one line I refused to let anyone cross. I signed my own consignment settlement. On the following Tuesday, I walked into the bank carrying a cashier's cheque and paid $21,800 directly against my parents' overdue mortgage and back taxes. I took the payoff confirmation letter out of its envelope right there in the parking lot and drove it straight to my mother and placed it in her hands. She read it twice through. My sister caught me in the stairwell doorway on my way out of the building that day, and this was the only single moment in this entire year that she genuinely lost her composure. I want you to notice exactly when that happened. Not when she lost. When she won. She held her clipboard down at her side, and her voice cracked right down the middle. You could have kept it. You had the money sitting right in your hand. Do you understand that you actually had it? I stood there in the doorway of the very building where my grandmother spent 22 years of her life and told her the only true answer I actually had. I couldn't keep it. I could only make absolutely sure nobody ever gets to call it worthless again. I closed my downtown shop for good on the 30th of June. The new owners have scaffolding up on the block now, and a developer's rendering taped inside the window of what used to be my father's lumber business. I rent a small 2-bay garage on the edge of town now. Colder, worse lighting, most of my old walk-in customers gone. My income down by roughly a third. Here is what came out of everything else, and I want to be accurate rather than comforting about it. The out-of-state collector, because I stood up in a public room and explained exactly what those ledgers actually were, ended up placing the entire ledger collection on long-term loan with our local historical society, housed in Harriet's one properly climate-controlled room inside a display case he personally funded. He pays me a monthly stipend to help conserve them 2 days a month, so I am now the caretaker of the very thing I couldn't afford to own, on somebody else's schedule, for a few $100s a month. It isn't a triumph. It's simply a job, and I take it anyway. The factory building itself sold separately to an out-of-state investor and is being converted into a self-storage facility. Everett Doyle's workbench now exists in 3 separate places, and it is never coming back together as one piece again. My sister's estate business had its best year on record. The attention from that auction made her name across 4 counties, and she now has more work than she can possibly handle. The current never actually stopped moving. It never does. It simply learned along the way that my grandmother had a name. My mother showed up at my new garage the week before Christmas, the very first time in my life she has ever come to see a place where I actually work. She stood in the doorway in her coat for a while, studying the bench, the vise, the pegboard of tools. Then she walked over and took the bench watch out of her purse. She'd apparently been carrying it around inside an old sock, exactly the way her own mother once would have. She set it down gently on my workbench and said, "Keep it running for me. I'm not any good at that part." That was all. She has still never actually apologised in words, and I have finally stopped waiting for her to. Those 2 facts simply sit quietly beside each other now, without cutting into me the way they used to. I still drive over on Sundays. I stopped bringing gifts a long time ago. I bring my tools instead, and I fix whatever happens to be broken in that house that week, and nobody in the room has to decide what any of it is worth. And my niece, 10 years old now, sits up on a stool beside me with her elbows on the bench. Last month, I taught her how to properly let a mainspring down slowly. One careful click of the key at a time, hand steady on the arbor the entire way through. That's always the very first thing you learn in this trade. Before you're ever allowed to take something apart, you first have to learn how to let go of it gently, without letting it break. My new garage has exactly one good lamp positioned over the bench, and a space heater I still keep meaning to replace. The watch sits at the back edge where I can always see it clearly. It still runs 40 seconds fast every single day, and I could correct that in a single afternoon if I wanted to, and I never ever will, because fixing it would mean removing the very last thing left in this world that my grandmother's own hands set with her own 2 fingers. Some nights, after finishing a job, I switch off the lamp and just stand there a moment in the dark, and I can hear it quietly ticking away. It was never really about keeping time. I used to believe that keeping a thing was the same as loving it. I understand now that the only part of it I ever truly managed to save was the part I was actually willing to lose. That's my story. 1 small wrapped box, 41 names, and a workbench I had to sell in order to finally say them out loud, in front of a room full of strangers. If there's something in your own family that everybody quietly agreed to call worthless, go take a real look at it again this week, and then say its name out loud to somebody who'll listen. If this story stayed with you, share it with whoever in your life needs to hear it right now. Drop a comment below, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.